Hi, Danny here from the Joshua Tree, and thanks for joining us. We're meeting on Sundays at 10 o'clock, but if you're just sticking with us online, then we're continuing our series in the book of Joshua. And today we get to this big chunk from chapters 13 to 21 where there's lots and lots of detail. It's the kind of thing that can be quite laborious to look at, it can seem quite irrelevant and a little bit overwhelming. I wonder if recently you've spent any time having to think about your will and preparing that, or looking at your current investments and thinking about retirement, making decisions about a job and looking at a job description that's been given to you. All of these contracts are often things where the detail matters. Whether it's an investment, or whether it's our estate, or whether it's a job, there are particular things in life where the details matter. It's important to understand. It's important to look and see what is excluded and what is included. And so as God's people take possession of the land that God has given to them, this section from chapters 13 to 21, it gives the detail about where the various tribes will be located, where their boundaries are. And it's actually the things within here that we see that seem to be out of the rhythm that actually draw us to key points that we can understand and apply today. Now, when you're given a document that seems quite lengthy, I don't know about you, but often I go to the conclusion to sort of get a big idea of where it's going to land, and then I go back and work my way through it. It might be that for you, you've handed in an assignment and you go straight towards the mark, and then you go back through and see the comments and make sense of it. So with this larger section, we see that there's a sort of conclusion to everything. In Joshua 21 verse 43 it says, "So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." Here's a summary of all that happens in chapters 13 to 21. God delivers an inheritance completely. He's delivered on his promises. God's people inherit and possess the land that's given to them. Throughout these chapters, though, are a couple of lessons that are learned. Lessons that can be learned as we see individuals who stand out from the crowd, where the monotonous rhythm is broken with a focus in on something different. We're going to see specifically an example to follow and an example to avoid. Having conquered the land, Israel can now inhabit it. So in chapter 13, verse 1, we read this. "When Joshua had grown old, and the Lord said to him, 'You are now very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over.'" What we see at the beginning of the section here is this great anticipation. And there's a picture of the extent to which the land that God has promised still needs to be inhabited. But there's a little bit of concern in the detail here in verse 1. Joshua is aged. And so like, a builder sort of saying, "Oh, here's the deadline," and that deadline keeps moving. So too, as we think about God's people being able to possess the land, there's a little bit of doubt coming into our mind. But we are reminded that the ability for God's people to receive what's been promised, to actually be recipients of the inheritance, isn't dependent on Joshua's shoulders, but in fact it's God who's going to deliver on his promises. It's God who gives the victory. And that's what the next few verses in chapter 13 go on to. But what we see here in chapter 13, verse 13, is one of the indicators that all was not going to be smooth sailing, even as they inherit and possess the land. But the Israelites, verse 13, did not drive out the people of Geshur and Makah, so they continued to live among the Israelites to this day. Chapter 13 is talking about the possessing of the land east of the Jordan before they crossed. 2.5 tribes, their allocated land is on the east of the Jordan River. What we see here is a small sign of disobedience, not following fully God's direction to fully conquer and dispel the inhabitants of the land. God's plan was for total conquest and an exclusive possession of the land. But what we see here is signs of something different. And so chapter 13 and 14 go on to sort of include that those tribes that are on the east of the river are part of the whole now that the land is being divided on the west of the Jordan. And what we see in chapter 14 is the first example of someone who sets an example that's worth following. Verse 6 of chapter 14. Now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God at Kadesh Barnea, about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land." What we see here is a focus in on someone who was close with Joshua. Caleb, with Joshua, was one of the 2 spies out of the 12 who first surveyed this land. Joshua and Caleb were the ones who faithfully trusted that the land could be delivered by God, that God would be able to overcome the people who possessed the land. And so again, Caleb recalls God's past promises, and he relates to Joshua about their shared history. Going on in verse 10, "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then." These are expiring words from Caleb, aren't they? After this long wait, as he too had to endure walking in the wilderness for a whole generation, the anticipation of realizing what's been promised, to be able to inhabit this land that was their inheritance, is here. And Caleb's faith seems to be strengthening with his age. The weaker he physically gets, the stronger is God within him. And so Caleb testifies that God is both powerful and present. He's willing to engage in what it looks like to trust God in this current season. And so Caleb goes on following this to claim a specific part of the land. But the real focus here is his attitude. Despite his age, he is wholehearted in his allegiance towards God. And when we move over to chapter 16 though, we start to see an example to avoid. Breaking up the monotony of the various lands and the boundaries that were given to the tribes. In chapter 16 verse 10 we see something that stands out. That one of the tribes, verse 10, did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. To this day the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, but are required to do forced labour. Again, there's another glimpse of failing to possess the land completely on God's terms. And again though, it's helpful for us to get a picture of what conquest looked like. We've seen lots of the killing that was involved as God gave victory to his people. A lot of death and destruction ordered by God and even delivered by God. What we see here again is that there's no sense of an ethnic cleansing. God's solution wasn't to totally eradicate every Canaanite that existed. It wasn't that they, as a people group, were the problems of the world, that as long as they could be eradicated, everyone else would be fine. But we see constantly that Israel isn't that much morally better than the other people. It's just that God had chosen to do a work in them, despite how flawed they were. And so again here in chapter 16 verse 10 is evidences of Israel's failure to believe, failure to trust God and obey him fully. But here we see that God is merciful to some of these Canaanites. A remnant will live within the people, not to be the status of a citizen, but forced to be a slave, to be a reminder that God has clear purposes, and that even the disobedience of his people will not dilute his plans. Going on in chapter 17, we see a further example of something to avoid for life in the land. Looking at one of the tribes of Joseph, the Masonites, they were not able to occupy these towns, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that region. However, when the Israelites grew stronger, they subjected the Canaanites to forced labour, but did not drive them out completely. Again, with the break of the repetitive, monotonous lists of tribes being given land and the east, west, south, north boundary, here we start to see that a tribe was not able to fully occupy land that was given to them. And we see why. That the Canaanites were determined to live there. Now, in the context of the book of Joshua and the victory that we've just seen him deliver, it seems like a fairly lame excuse. After all that God has done and all that he's promised, for a tribe of God's people to not be able to possess the land because the Canaanites seem too determined, seems to be a failure of belief and oversight into everything that they've just witnessed. Verse 14, the people of Joseph said to Joshua, "Why have you given us only one allotment and one portion for an inheritance? We are a numerous people, and the Lord has blessed us abundantly." "If you are so numerous," Joshua answered, "and if the hill country of Ephraim is too small for you, go up into the forest and clear land for yourselves, there in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephites." Now, what first seems like a reasonable complaint on the surface, that the land that they've been allocated isn't big enough, like a kid sharing their room and pleading for their own room, Joshua says that there's actually something deeper and more disturbing about their complaint. There's a real contrast here between the Masonites and Caleb. Caleb was fearless and faithful in his declaration of trusting to God deliver on what he's promised. But here we see that there's some resistance. There's an unwillingness to actually own the hill country that's already been given to them. And so verse 16, they reply, "The hill country is not enough for us. And all the Canaanites who live in the plain have chariots fitted with iron, both those in Bethshan and its settlements, and those in the valley of Jezreel." But Joshua said to the tribes of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are numerous and very powerful. You'll have not only one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it, and the farthest limits will be yours. Though the Canaanites have chariots fitted with iron, and though they are strong, you can drive them out." You see, this tribe of Israel were unwilling to take on the inhabitants of the land. They're both overwhelmed by the workload of having to clear the mountainous terrain, but also to confront these Canaanites and their chariots. And so again, it's a short memory. It's a failure to trust in the moment that God has the power to overcome what's before them. And it's a failure to just remember the way that God has shown himself, the way that God has proven himself. And so Joshua will not settle for their excuse. He's not going to reallocate the boundaries, because this is a moment for them to take what is already theirs, to actually experience what God has set apart. They're called to walk in faith. And so this example of the tribe who felt squashed out, who weren't realizing the potential of what they were given, is again a warning against unbelief. Some more concerning signs come up in chapter 18, verse 1. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance. So Joshua said to the Israelites, "How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you?" Again, the concerning signs. 7 tribes refusing to walk forward in faith, but rather just remaining stagnant. Now, we all know that often there are situations where doing nothing is more tempting and more easy than actually stepping forward in faith. but they had to realize what had been set apart for them. Now, certainly there are times where faith is about standing firm, but there are also situations where faith is stepping out, stepping forward and receiving what God has already provided. And so for these tribes, this was the situation for them. But despite these concerning details, when we get to the end of chapter 20 and 21, all of God's plans had been realized. But just like perhaps after you've signed the contract for the new job, after a few months or years you realize, yeah, this is good, but I'm not complete. Or when you buy the apartment or the house that you've been looking for and you sort of get to that point where you're like, it's not satisfying as much as I thought. So too, as God's people live in the land, it's far from a picture of perfection. And it's far from being the completion of God's plan. And so we see in chapter 20 and 21 some of these realities. Chapter 20 verse 1. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge, as I instructed you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person accidentally and unintentionally may flee there and find protection from the avenger of blood." Now, we've seen that as God's people having been rescued from slavery and given the law and constructing the tabernacle, this travelling tent, that there were particular practices that were required, that there was a priesthood. Now, these patterns remain of a priesthood and offerings and sacrifices, but also this sense of places of refuge. Again, we start to get this illusion that God is under no pretense that things are going to be perfect. That there's going to be harm. There's going to be people killed. There's going to be people who need to be tried. Justice is going to need to be determined. And so these processes are going to be important for God's people in the land. Although they're inheriting this particular piece of land, just as God had promised for them, although there was much blessing and goodness in it, it was far from perfect. And so again, this summary picture at the end of chapter 21, the Lord gave all the land he had sworn to his ancestors. They had taken possession of it and settled there, and the Lord gave them rest. Every one was fulfilled. Now, although this is not the completion of God's plan, it was a great picture of what God's intent was for his people to have rest in his provision. And I guess for anyone who's leaving any kind of estate to those who love, that is your desire too. To be able to provide something that is a blessing, that will enrich those whom you love. And so we see here, though, that this land, small in size on a global scale, limited in its boundaries, and protected for a particular time in history, is not going to be the full realization of God's intent. It's ultimately through the Lord Jesus, who establishes an eternal kingdom, a life beyond death, a new creation, where millions upon millions who seek God and trust in Jesus will experience their rest, will be fulfilled, will eventually call home, that God's perfect plan will be completed. And so too now, as we await that, we who hold on to Jesus, I think it's helpful for us to see the examples to avoid and the examples to follow. And that picture of Caleb, a man who had waited, a man who, despite his age, was more and more invigorated as he saw and believed that God delivers on his promises. What a great picture of how to view your life. And not viewing your life about when is the earliest that you can retire so that you can check out for life and just sort of sit back and relax. But how can you actually grow in effectiveness and use and strength of character throughout your life. What a great critique of our modern view of retirement. This picture of Caleb, who, with an emphasis on faithfulness, grew more and more in zeal for all the things that God loves, who was willing to be used in any kind of way. And so too, the example of the tribe from Joseph, the Masonites, is an example to avoid. There are those seasons where we just need to step out, where it's literally like the no standing sign. The no standing signs on the roadways are there where it's actually dangerous for you to stop. Even just stop for a moment. The whole road is constructed for you to keep moving. And there are areas in our life where God is wanting us to step forward in faith, to claim what is already being given to us, to actually trust that He is good and powerful, rather than being insecure and fearful. And maybe it's in relationships, and maybe it's in our own vocation and where we spend our time, and maybe it's in decisions about our finances, or maybe it's in restoring a broken relationship. Are there situations where right now you're being invited to step and walk in faith, not to just stand still? Friends, God's good desire, His ultimate inheritance, is a rest that is eternal, a place where we will ultimately be fulfilled. It's not that we don't think about our financial investments. It's not that it's not wise for us to set up a will and think about how we can care and support for those who love us. But we do so within the framework that we who hold to Jesus are given an eternal inheritance. And if that is not who you're holding on to, the Lord Jesus, then I want to encourage you to consider that the inheritance that He establishes is the only one that lasts on the other side of death. And so that no matter how impressive your investment portfolio might look like, no matter how satisfied your family members will be at what you are able to pass on to them, ultimately, true fulfillment will only be found as we experience life on the other side of death. Life that lasts. Life that can only be found when we hold fast to Jesus.